Hi, and welcome to everybody just joining. Okay, good. Thank you so much for making yourselves available this afternoon. My name is Gloria Majiga, and I work with the Center for Environmental Policy and Advocacy. Before we start, you can just type into the chat box your name, where you're from, and introduce yourself. This is always a great opportunity to network. And so I think now we can start. We've got everybody in. So once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second part of the BRACC program's virtual learning event. And today we'll be presenting and discussing findings from the recent evaluation of the BRACC program. As we did on Tuesday, for those that were with us, we have structured today's session in two presentations, and then we'll have time for discussion. Today we'll be with Elaine Huang and Catherine Vincent, and they'll be presenting some insights into the evaluation of the program design. And then we'll take a brief pause just for a discussion, and we look forward to hearing from everyone your own reflections and insights. And after we've had that discussion, Liz Venable will be sharing Prosper's experience of resilience measurement and highlight the implications for resilience measurement in the future. Then we'll also have a discussion. We would really love to have as much time as we possibly can for a discussion and for your questions and just your reflections. The chat box will be monitored. So if you've got any questions as the presentations go on, please feel free to type them right in as you're listening so that they can be answered when we have the time for the discussions. You can also raise your hands as we discuss. There will be the opportunity, but if you can just type them in as the presentations go, then you can go ahead and do that, and we'll make sure that they're answered or responded to. Please make sure etiquette for Zoom. We know it's been a long 2 years of using Zoom, so let's all remember our usual etiquette on Zoom, and that's to make sure that you're muted as you're speaking. We can switch off our videos just to make sure that everybody is able to stay connected. We should also note that we are recording this event, and it will only be used for sharing the learning on our website. We've got a BRACC website. I'll be sharing the link to the website in the chat box shortly. So you can access these recordings, and you can also share them widely with people that may not have been able to attend today. And with that, I'd like to welcome everyone, and of course, acknowledge everyone in the BRACC program team. It's been such an amazing couple of years working with everyone, and everybody's put in so much work. So it's really great to be here together and to learn about the lessons from the different aspects of the program. A special thanks to the Prosper UN and NGO Consortia, GIZ, African Parks, and the Modern Cooking for Healthy Forest Consortium, and the BRACC Knowledge and Policy Hub team for their support in conducting the evaluation. And of course, the extensive efforts in implementing the BRACC program, about which we'll soon be hearing. If you'd also like to learn more about the different components of the program, you can quickly access the website, which I said I will be sharing, and you can also be in touch with anyone from the hub. That's myself, Catherine, Liz, and quite a few other people that you'll probably be meeting today. And with that, I would like to hand over to Elaine for the first presentation. Elaine, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I will share my screen first and then start. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your time for being here. So my name is Elaine, and I'm going to talk about the program design today. So I guess first it's why do we want to learn about program design? And I guess with as many of you have already known that actually it's a critical component, even though we don't notice it every day, but then it's kind of a very critical component to pave the way of the work that we're doing and implement it within a program, and definitely has impact on the outcomes and also the resilience in Malawi. So when designing the program, there's actually this kind of like relationship features that we're focusing on, and also the system features that we're focusing on. For example, like how to build trust, and also institutional interactions to facilitate those discussion and dialogue. And definitely the system features of it, it's how to kind of address the pre-existing norms or bias that could maybe negatively affect the partnership that takes shape within the program. So that's kind of a setup of the why. Therefore, in this presentation, instead of focusing too much on the evaluation of the program itself, I think we'll put more emphasis on reflecting what actually worked and what challenges that were faced and how to learn from the experience of BRACC. So in this presentation, I'll start with kind of the refreshment of the kind of like memory of like the component consortium. So for those who already know us, to bear with me a little bit. And then Catherine will talk about the building and sequencing and targeting, as well as the adaptive management. Then we'll move on to the key learning questions of the program design component of the evaluation. First is actually how did the program design of BRACC help to achieve the resilience outcome? The second is how the effective coordination was being enabled through program design. And third is what can we actually learn from this experience? So the the BRACC program was implemented to strengthen the resilience of poor and vulnerable households through shock and reduce their annual dependence on humanitarian aid. So it actually adopted an integrated framework approach to resilience. In terms of the BRACC program itself, it took up a multi-layer strategy and combining with market-based approach to improve people's livelihood, manage natural resources, and scalable social safety net that respond more predictably and efficiently to weather and climate related shocks. And so it's actually a multi-consortium model, have involving partnership across different sectors, including NGOs, UN agencies, and private sectors. So those are the 5 components of BRACC that's being implemented by 18 different partnering organizations. And one of the components is actually the knowledge policy and support, which is the BRACC Hub, and that's leading the evaluation, a lot of learning and policy advocacy for the BRACC program. And there's just one note here that actually different components have different start date, and there's actually have implication for this sort of program, kind of the implication for what it could mean in terms of the implementation itself, but we'll come back to this point later. So as I mentioned, there are 18 implementing partner within BRACC and an additional separate knowledge policy unit, the BRACC Hub. So the role of BRACC Hub was to support the program level coordination, evaluation, learning, knowledge management, and policy advocacy. And so it's actually a very complicated program involving different sectors and partnering organization. And how does the program design how does the program design facilitate the learning and enable coordination? It's actually the key point that we're going to look at later. So some of you are already familiar with this graph. This is the 5 components of BRACC. And I will give the floor to Catherine now to talk about the bundling and sequencing.
Thanks, Elaine. Can you go to the next slide? Great. So as Elaine has said, and how this was elaborated in the Prosper theory of change and the BRACC theory of change, is the belief that to build resilience, we need to have a combination of different interventions that are sequenced and layered and linked and addressing the different levels of activities, so including household level, community level, and looking at the level of markets and ecosystems. And so by layering and sequencing complementary interventions within particular areas, within communities, and having tailored packages targeting the different wealth categories, through doing that, Prosper was aiming to accelerate the transition towards resilience and break this cycle of humanitarian crises, as Elaine has outlined. So at household level, the bundling of activities is basically reflecting the fact that resilience building needs us to consider anticipatory, absorptive, and adaptive capacity. And so if we're supporting progress in one area, then that can create a chain effect elsewhere. So in Tuesday's session, for example, Liz spoke about a number of the different interventions. If we think of like the livestock pass-on scheme, for example, ensuring that success of that also requires that there's animal health support available. Hence, there were also community animal health workers. And improving agricultural yields and outcomes was another big component of the programme. And so to support increasing yields, for example, by providing access to inputs through cash for inputs, there also needs to be consideration of the fact that if more outputs are generated, then there needs to be some kind of post-harvest management. So, for example, PICS bags was another intervention, as well as, of course, support for market access, so that excess can be sold for profit. So within BRACC, the bundling of interventions was linked to the layering across the different levels of focus. So market development was one component, also the strengthening of the shock-sensitive social protection and community level early warning systems and so on. There was also sequencing of activities over time, because of course, providing changes at one point may require changes to take place later on. But that was a little bit impeded by changes to the programme. So of course, because large components of the programme ended earlier than anticipated, not all of that sequencing was able to take place. But this table on the slide here just gives an idea of some of the interventions that were used and the bundling that took place together. And they were also targeted to the different needs of the population. So for many of the activities conducted within BRACC, there was a household targeting approach that followed the National Resilience Strategy approach to wealth categorization. So you can see on the left-hand side of the table, we've got hanging in, stepping up, and stepping out. So the hanging in households are those with probably little potential for market engagement, and those who are going to be using agriculture as a safety net rather than to move up the livelihood ladder, whereas stepping out will be those households that have some capacity to generate surplus production or start engaging in commercial activity. And then stepping out are those that can perhaps step out of entire dependence on agriculture and natural resource-based livelihoods into other sectors of the economy. Next slide, please, Elaine. So what then are the kind of pros and cons of this approach and the lessons learned? Well, obviously the increasing complexity of targeting, having those three different wealth categories, does require greater effort at the start to place households in each category. But the trade-off with that is that it can better match the participant capabilities to the right activities for them at the starting point that they're at. So it can give rise to more effective and equitable outcomes. Now, the intention within the BRACC programme was to use the UBR for targeting, but it wasn't quite as ready as anticipated at the start. So in the end, that was only used in BRACC to identify some of the hanging in households. The hanging in households in some of the other districts had to be identified, building on targeting conducted in previous programmes. And the NGO consortium of Prosper adapted community wealth ranking and then undertook participant selection from that. Now, of course, there are some considerations to bear in mind with community wealth ranking. It can be very time consuming because it has to be done in all the target communities. And it does require sensitization, both among community members and often project staff who are more accustomed to the typical approach of targeting the poorest of the poor, which is obviously very predominant in Malawi. But the idea with those different wealth categories is slightly different to just being related to poverty, because it has to include capacity as well. And that community-based approach is of course subjective and can lack comparability from place to place. And there were some issues created early on with the programme design because the overall distribution of households in those different target wealth categories didn't match the intended work plan. So there had to be a bit of recategorization taking place at the very start. But that said, from a community perspective, it was largely appreciated for its transparency. And the quotation on the top right-hand side of the slide here is indicative of many positive comments that were received in the evaluation. And then, so once that had been done, participants for the different interventions were drawn from that community wealth ranking exercise, but a challenge there was the resources available for coverage, because it wasn't possible to cover everyone from all the from one particular wealth category in any one location. And for many of the interventions, although not all, labour capacity was a prerequisite, and that ran the risk of potentially excluding certain categories of population, for example, the elderly or the disabled, if they don't have labour capacity available. But Prosper did have its own gender equality and social inclusion strategy, and there was some flexibility to register participants in particular interventions from households. So the quotation on the bottom right-hand side here gives an example of how it would have been possible to register a different participant from a particularly vulnerable household, with the hope that the benefits would then be shared more broadly within that household. So overall, as we heard about on Tuesday, the evaluation did show that the bundling was quite effective, and most beneficiaries did participate in more than one intervention, but overall that the hanging in households were participating in less. And given that many of those typically marginalized groups, including female-headed households and elderly-headed households, were overrepresented in the hanging in group, that does mean that there are opportunities to further ensure inclusion, and that obviously needs to be borne in mind in future programs. Also, just a note on the effectiveness of targeting, the UN consortium that was focusing on the hanging in households and the NGO consortium that was focusing on the stepping up and stepping out were not targeting the same communities. So although the activities led to improvements for those participants and the households that they came from, the kind of initial emphasis behind having those different wealth categories is that you can develop intra-community resilience if you're targeting all of those different wealth categories in one place at one time. And that wasn't necessarily the case here. Next slide, please, Elaine. And the next one. So then just briefly on adaptive management. Adaptive management allows tweaking and course correction if, say, the findings from monitoring exercises show that results are not playing out as expected, if assumptions in the theory of change are not holding, or if there are external circumstances that have been affecting implementation. And of course, during the lifetime of the BRACC program, there were quite a few of those external forces that were affecting implementation. So there were elections and re-elections, and then of course COVID, which we're all very familiar with. There were a lot of adaptations, understandably, that took place in response to COVID because of the need to reduce face-to-face activities. But the Prosper Consortium, particularly working with the climate resilient livelihoods, were able to continue most of the field interventions after some initial planning, making sure that appropriate prevention and mitigation measures were in place. But there were some impacts there. So the village savings and loans groups, for example, were affected by the fact that they weren't able to meet as often and having lower savings levels due to reduced capacity to continue with livelihood activities. And there were some challenges with supply chain issues as a result of COVID, which affected availability and price of certain inputs that were required. So, for example, construction materials for evacuation centres, which were a key part of the community risk reduction aspect. But COVID, as we've all seen, did lead to some innovation and creativity. So the African Parks component changed some of their campaigning methods and used radio and TV broadcasting instead of in-person and field-based meetings, which meant that they were able to reach bigger groups of people in more cost-effective ways. The GIZ-led component, which was focusing on the social protection aspect, required very close working with government counterparts, and was often contingent on decisions being made within government. And of course, the external situation meant that a different set of priorities overtook the government agenda, and that ultimately meant that the GIZ work was stalled, and in the end, ultimately so fundamentally affected that it came to an end early. And before COVID happened, most of the adaptations observed in the program were more tactical, so related to changing the means of delivery as opposed to strategic in terms of changing what the program was doing. But there were a couple of examples of strategic adaptation, and we mentioned some of those on Tuesday. So one was to do cash for inputs instead of input fares to make available inputs for agricultural production. That was something in which there had been interest already, and there was significant evidence on the benefits of providing cash in terms of flexibility and not creating market distortions. But I think the COVID situation probably prompted that, because obviously of the need not to encourage big gatherings. And then the crisis modifier, also mentioned on Tuesday by Lena, was subject to some strategic adaptations in its design. So to meet its aim of protecting resilience gains in the face of environmental shocks, initially the aim had been to put in objective and transparent triggers, such as using satellite-based data, for example, but that didn't end up working. And instead, the crisis modifier was working with other donors, using triggers in the MVAC process to trigger the lean season response. So that's two examples of strategic adaptations. On adaptive management, we have to also mention that the kind of lumpiness of finance availability throughout the lifespan of the BRACC program, which eventually culminated in significant budget cuts that led to reduction in the scope of the program, was a challenge. It meant that implementing partners were having to review quarterly and annual forecasts several times during the program lifespan, which of course is time consuming, and whilst doing that, it takes away attention from the implementation. And that of course was an unforeseen challenge. But more broadly, to have an adaptive approach to programming requires that there's a similarly flexible approach to financial management, because if you're needing to make adaptations to what you're doing, then you need to have the concordant capacity to change the money that you need available at one time to do that. So adaptive management doesn't work if there are very rigid financial management arrangements in place. And it's a common challenge across development programs, because of course there is a need for financial accountability, but that can definitely impede the capacity for adaptation. And within BRACC, it meant that often good fund absorption was achieved at the expense of accurate forecasting, and adaptations that could have improved results were sometimes curtailed because of the need to closely stick to that forecasting. So a key lesson is for adaptive management to work in practice, it needs to be accompanied by appropriate flexibility in financial management as well. Back to you, Elaine.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. So that was some of the points that we're going to come back later, but then now I'm going to move on to the sort of a synthesis of like how these learning question is being answered in our evaluation. So the first part is actually the program design and how it actually helped to achieve the resilience outcomes. And as Catherine mentioned before, there's actually a lot of unexpected circumstances that actually doesn't allow us to really see the full, like do the full contribution analysis or something to really to say how it directly have a causal relationship to the resilience outcome. But through the interviews that we've done with the implementing partner, we can start to see some evidence of towards those change. So first, it's actually the sort of how the multi-consortium model brought together different actors to like allow for some resilience outcome. So for example, almost all implementing partners in our interview actually commenting that this kind of wide range of partners and organization within BRACC is actually very helpful and beneficial for their work. It has some positive and added value. And as an example, one of the NGO partner actually shared that the learning component of it actually allow them to really learn from diverse expertise, such as FAO's hotspot mapping and UNDP's district disaster risk management activities. And those are actually very beneficial in the work that they're doing. And one NGO partner also emphasized that the consortium partnership created within BRACC actually help to a lot of organizations to let go of the sense of like competition on the ground and to really create a joint common goal to work together. The second point is how this kind of novel configuration, like partnering between NGO and UN agency, actually help to contribute to some like learning and change within the project because of the project activities. So the example here is like the cash transfer. In a typical program, like beneficiaries might be given like voucher to exchange for agriculture input from suppliers. But then like what is being realized is that this practice is not particularly sustainable because it's creating an artificial market. So what is being done in Prosper Consortium is that they brought in the perspectives from private sectors and actually allow market dynamic to have an understanding of market dynamic as well as the role like of the functioning market to play in absorbing climate shocks. So having a market-led approach to provide farmers with cash to select their inputs and work with suppliers to raise awareness of the market opportunities for selling in remote area. So this kind of like configuration of bringing NGO, UN, and private sector partnership together in Prosper actually create a shifting thinking of how farmers can engage with market. Another kind of evidence of how this program design helps to achieve resilient outcomes is this integrating approach actually helps breaking the organization silos. So many implementing partners actually share that they have learned from other sectors in developing intervention. And some of the partners actually share that they learn the kind of like issue of social protection, gender inclusion in a more integrated perspectives, and it actually help to allow them to do their work in a more appropriate, like kind of holistic way in microfinancing project, as an example. Some partner also share that they actually, this kind of like integrated approach also help different UN agency to have an opportunities to bring together their expertise and have a dialogue that that's a space that's being created within BRACC program to allow them to actually develop intervention that have combined different perspectives. So the second learning question is asking how effective coordination was being enabled. And this has direct implication of how the design of BRACC was a governance it's being set up and how that enables like certain dialogues or partnership. So what we found was that early communication was actually very critical to bring in different perspectives and bring in different partners to establish trusting relationship among partners. And that has very important implication because, for example, when the, at the proposal development stage, harmonizing different ways of implementing program activities early on is key. One of the example is in the Prosper program, how a different proposal was being put through and then merged together actually doesn't really allow much room for negotiation and change after. So that dialogue could have been done early on and facilitated by help hub units or like funders to really allow for exploration and co-development. The role of consortium coordinator was actually pretty useful in ensuring communication and avoid duplicated effort. So in Malawi, it's very common for multiple organizations on the ground to work with same community beneficiary and sometimes bringing very similar support intervention. So there's some like there's a need for formal coordination structure between implementing partners to avoid duplication of effort and create synergy. And for example, like Prosper has this UN and NGO coordinator at the national level, as well as coordinators at the 4 districts. And so those coordinator actually is pretty instrumental in helping coordinating, for example, quarterly review meetings with the funders, field visits, technical working group that are important for within consortium communication. They also helped with kind of like less formal coordination, for example, more ad hoc communication, direct meeting between technical staffs. Actually, it's pretty helpful in terms of resolving any challenges or dispute when it's like when it occurred, it can be addressed right away. And so that was why. Okay, and so adaptive management component of it, it's actually what Catherine was mentioning before, and this is related to the, for example, program reporting and how requirement and detail forecasting, it's really not flexible in terms of how the project's being unfolded. And related to the coordinator points, the district level engagement with government is actually very important to increase the buy-in and also the likelihood of increasing sustainability of the project activities. So all programs in BRACC actually is implemented in close cooperation with relevant government staffs. And some of the implementing partners share that actually really that's very helpful, and having a coordinator to help facilitating that, or having a coordinating unit to help facilitating that, it's really helped to have the commitment from the government and create a sustainability of the activities. So in terms of the role of BRACC Hub, the facilitation of okay, so the facilitation of learning and promote knowledge are recommended as like by a lot of actually all the implemented partners in the interview for future programs. They view the role of BRACC Hub as a supporting unit that brought in relevant new research findings and facilitating knowledge sharing between consortium members and also with external stakeholders. And also there's an important element of generating lessons, being reflexive, and also documenting the learning for BRACC, it's being valued. And many partners really highlighted the role of this kind of external hub in supporting or like building the capacity, building partners' capacity in engaging with government and ensuring that the emerging lessons it's informing the policy development. So for these, what can we actually learn for the future programming of this kind? First, it's what we mentioned earlier about like how important the early communication and early communicating expectation is. Actually, different components in BRACC was actually different consortium and different components come at different time, and it had to create some tension or some kind of implication in terms of what is being expected and what kind of how much space for negotiating different methodology and approach can actually be allowed. So implementing partners in our interview actually has different organization that coming from different organization culture, bringing different expectation and working under different practice. So having that sort of like early communication about what does it mean to work together within a program, it's actually very critical. And also in terms of the relationship building aspect of it. So even though we found that some of the implementing partner found that the diverse expertise is really helpful in terms of doing for them to do their work, but it's actually not fully utilized. These partners have like different strengths to enhance the resilience outcomes, but the wide cross-program learning actually hasn't really been fully utilized. Some of the partners feel like they can really learn from different consortiums activities and really build synergy, create synergy with the work that they're doing. And then the next point is actually synchronizing the start point for different consortium could be enabled, could better enable creation of a joint narrative for BRACC. And this is related to the identity aspect of it. So when different consortium coming to the program at different times, sometimes there are competing narratives on the ground. And also there's like not really clear working ground rules to be set up in the beginning. And so sometimes this is especially the case when we're looking at, for example, social media outlet, and there are a lot of like different kind of similar activities that's being put out, but what does this mean to be a BRACC kind of like identity, it's sometimes unclear. And so having like synchronized starting time to really set up, okay, a joint narratives will actually help with engaging with external stakeholders, and for example. So creating enabling environment to support partner in overcoming structural constraint, especially when working with UN agency. As we talked about before, when BRACC was created, BRACC actually helped to create a kind of space for different UN agencies to work together. And there's actually a need to really make the opportunity to enable the environment, like enable different partners from different sectors and expertise to really create synergy together. This can be, some of the partners actually suggest that this can be set up through, for example, like MOU from the beginning, or share finance, joint monitoring framework, or like common indicators to really allow UN partners to fully be able to work together. In terms of coordinating and coordinating units, or like coordination for future programs, such as the role like the hub, one very important point is the kind of the governance structure in terms of addressing the power imbalance between different partnering organizations. So as we mentioned several times, there are actually different working culture from different organizations. There's also an issue of the expectation of time commitment from different implementing partners. And so facilitating that dialogue early on, it's an important role. At the same time, how to really address the power imbalance between different sectors and actors in the program is key for coordinating units in the future programs. So for example, Prosper coordinators actually help to navigate different needs within the consortium and facilitate resolutions when there was like power imbalance between partners. And another example is like a hub actually planned high-level program-wide governance structure from the start, but it actually didn't really play out because of the starting day was kind of a bit different. But then if it's fully being implemented, it can actually really facilitate a mutual learning and create joint goals. And the last point is what I mentioned before about kind of having a coordinated communication channel to engage diverse partners. So the way that BRACC was being proactively enabling different NGOs and groups to work together was really appreciated, and many NGO partners also expressed value in engaging policy units and engaging governments to like consolidate the program-wide lessons. But future program can really think about how to build on this effort and really create a sort of like shared identity and joint goal to take a step further to communicate with governments and communities. through a kind of more coordinating channel and invest in collaborative relationship among actors, not only within the program itself, but also implementing programs perhaps in the similar areas, even if it's probably funded by different programs. So I will return the floor to Gloria.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elaine and Catherine. Quite a lot of useful insights. Very interesting to see also how COVID-19 really affected the changes in programming and the response to that, the innovative responses. Are there any questions from our audience? You can just raise your hand and then we can take your questions. We've got a few minutes for discussion. Okay, there's a comment in the chat box from Lisa Banda that says overcoming structural constraints is really important, not just for UN agencies, even with governments. At times, these are setbacks to achieving objectives of various programs. That's quite true. I think the program really did quite an interesting job of showing how you can interlink different agencies and different aspects, and I think it is something to learn from, even in engagement with government. Thank you so much for that, Lisa. Are there any other comments or questions? You can type them into the chat box or raise your hand. All right, if we don't have any other questions, then I'm going to invite Liz Venable, who will be sharing Prosper's experience of resilience measurement and highlight implications for resilient measurement in future. Liz?
Thanks, Gloria. I'll take just a minute to share my screen.
Okay, thanks, Liz. For anyone just joining us, please go ahead and you can type your name or you can share your thoughts in the chat box. If you've got any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type them in the chat box and we'll be responding to them at the end of the presentation.
All right, I think I've got my screen up. Gloria, can you confirm that you can see my presentation?
Yes, yes, we can see it.
All right, thanks very much, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. So this presentation will focus on lessons from resilience measurement that the BRACC Hub has taken throughout the course of our work with BRACC and particularly with Prosper. So I'll start with a bit of background on resilience measurement. For those who have a lot of background in resilience measurement already, this will probably be mainly review, but in case there are those with us who have less background, I'm hoping that this will provide a little bit of context for some of the issues and challenges that we'll discuss later in the presentation. So resilience has really grown as an area of interest in the development field over the last couple decades. And with that increased focus on the concept of resilience, there's also been a growing interest in resilience measurement. And one of the things that I think many organizations working in the resilience space have come to understand is that both resilience program design and resilience measurement need to be grounded in a nuanced and detailed definition of resilience that reflects the objectives of the program, policy, or organization that's using it. So one example of a way that thinking about resilience and resilience definitions has grown more nuanced is increased awareness of the need for a resilient community or system to not only necessarily return to the previous state it was in after a shock, but to improve upon it. So for example, if a community has high poverty before a shock, it may not necessarily be sufficient to return to that same state of poverty after a shock. So a lot of definitions of resilience have begun to incorporate the idea of gains over time. So some examples of this, I put a few definitions of resilience from different sources on this slide, but a couple examples, we see that the National Resilience Strategy for Malawi, in its definition of resilience, references development and opportunities to thrive. We see, for example, the USA definition references inclusive growth. Another thing that we see is that often, but not always, resilience is defined with respect to specific types of hazards, such as climate change. So again, some definitions reference that, but others have more broad definitions of the types of shocks and stressors that they reference. So just some general approaches to resilience measurement and a framework for thinking about them. So one approach that one can take to measuring resilience is what we call hazards-based measurement. And so this approach measures the size of a shock that a system can withstand and still be able to return to equilibrium. So this is very rarely used in the development field, but it's very common in other concepts of resilience used in other fields, such as mechanical engineering and ecology, for example. The next approach to resilience measurement is impact-based. So this approach measures the magnitude of impact that happens as a result of a shock. So commonly, the way we would think about framing this is measuring losses or costs after a shock occurs. And it's generally done retrospectively. So to be observed, a shock must occur, and then we can look at some of the outcomes that would then be used to calculate things like losses or costs. But it can also be based on modeling, especially in cases where we don't have a shock occurring within the time frame of measurement. And then the last approach, which is definitely the most common in the development field, is systems or capacity-based approaches to resilience measurement. So in this case, we're measuring proxy indicators for an individual or system's ability to anticipate, prepare for, cope with, recover from, or adapt to evolving hazards. And in many cases, these indicators are classified in accordance with different conceptualizations of capacities in resilience, particularly the 3 A's and T, so anticipatory capacity, adaptive capacity, and absorptive capacity, as well as transformation or transformative capacity. And so again, this is a very common approach in development, and it makes use of many different types of qualitative or quantitative data. And one advantage of this approach is that you don't necessarily have to have a shock occurring within the time frame your evaluation is taking place in order to measure this. But a key challenge is ensuring that those proxy variables that you believe are associated with ability to withstand shocks really are indeed associated with resilience, and figuring out how to validate that. So some emerging themes are with respect to best practices for resilience measurement. There's no kind of one common decided approach that one should take to resilience measurement, but various experts and guidance in the area of resilience measurement does have some common ideas. So the first 3 are kind of related to the importance of having a strong program theory as backing for your resilience measurement approach. So the first lesson that we see from the literature here is resilience indicators and frameworks are more likely to be useful, especially for the context of learning, if they are very specific and contain good detail. So that could mean specific to the type of shocks that you're concerned about, specific to the types of outcomes. So thinking about the resilience of what, to what, and for whom. In addition, resilience measurement should be context specific. So again, this relates to things like understanding what are the shocks that you're most concerned with and what are the causal pathways to resilience that exist in the context where you are working. And then resilience measurement should be realist and theory-based. So again, understanding linkages between the policies or programs that you're implementing and the resilience outcomes that you want to achieve, and designing your indicators and measurement approaches around those. Another key theme is there is growing recognition that it's important to distinguish between traditional development indicators or objectives, such as reducing poverty, and specific resilience outcomes. But at the same time, there's a recognition that traditional development indicators are going to play an important role in resilience measurement. However, they alone are insufficient. So just measuring, say, things like poverty or nutrition outcomes usually does not get at the essence of resilience the way that most organizations define it and the way that reflects their objectives. Resilience measurements should also be tailored to program needs and their capacity. So taking into account things like budget, practices and evaluation, such as ensuring that you're using smart indicators, and also emphasis on when you're doing impact evaluation, ensuring that you have good methods for identifying a counterfactual. A few quick words about resilience measurement in Malawi. So the National Resilience Strategy provides a bit of a starting place for thinking about resilience in this context. It provides a definition of resilience and articulates theory for building resilience pathways in Malawi. It also identifies some important knowledge gaps around resilience, including how resilience graduation might work and what are the most effective ways to bundle interventions. So both kind of themes very relevant to BRACC. And it provides a common program framework indicator. So it's currently in provisional form, but it includes some recommended indicators for tracking resilience at the national level. This list of indicators includes a lot of standard development indicators, so things like % annual growth in agricultural GDP, but it also includes some more complex indicators that seem to be more specific to resilience. So an example here is return on investment or livelihood saved from averting food and nutrition crisis compared to past crises. So that's kind of a nod towards perhaps that impact measurement approach to resilience. In addition to the National Resilience Strategy, there have been a lot of innovative approaches to resilience measurement applied in Malawi. So some examples of a few of the tools that have been used are the FAO's REMA resilience measurement tool, as well as the high frequency resilience data collection that was first piloted by Sierra Subali in their MIRA project and has now been adapted by the rapid feedback monitoring system and has been scaled up to a number of districts. FCDO specific resilience measurement note. So again, necessary kind of background for some of the discussion we'll have later. Under FCDO, the key performance indicators are defined by the ICF results framework, and the most commonly used in the context of resilience in Malawi and the most viewed as directly related to resilience outcomes for households and communities is KPI-4, number of people whose resilience has been improved as a result of ICF support. All right, so that's some basic background on resilience measurement, kind of how far it's come in recent decades, as well as some background on resilience measurement in Malawi. And so now I'll move on to talking a bit about the measurement approach of BRACC. And I'll note that a lot of this is specific to Prosper, as that was the component that BRACC Hub worked most closely with in terms of resilience measurement. So I'll start with discussion of reporting on KPI-4, number of households with improved resilience as a result of the program. So Prosper designed their reporting approach to this in line with guidance from FCDO. And so they decided to use an index approach, which is one option for reporting on KPI-4. And so they defined a resilience index based on basically a checklist of resilience categories that a household could achieve. And so for each of these indicators, a household was defined as being resilient in that aspect if they met that checklist item, and not resilient if they did not. So for example, if they were found to have spent income to improve resilience, they were classified as achieving resilience on that particular indicator. If they didn't, they were not. The index value was then calculated by adding up the number of indicators for which a household was found to be resilient. And then Prosper selected a threshold score that defined households as resilient or not. So if your index score was above that threshold, your household was counted as resilient. If it was below, it was not counted as resilient. And then KPI-4 reporting was based on the number of households that went from being not resilient to resilient according to that index and threshold. We actually ended up calculating several versions of the index using different combinations of indicators and cutoffs. And this was because some of the documentation that Prosper had on the definition of their index was a bit unclear. There were two different ways that the index could be calculated, and BRACC Hub was unclear which one was the preferred methodology. So we calculated resilience using both specifications in our evaluation. And then we also put together a third index, and that was based on some concerns about some of the indicators being ambiguous in terms of their relationship with resilience. So one example, household received assistance during lean season. In some cases, receiving assistance can help a household be more resilient in the face of shocks, but it could also be an indication that that household has low resilience and therefore needs assistance. And so ambiguous indicators like that we removed, and we produced an alternative index comprising indicators that we thought had a more clear relationship with resilience. So just to show some of the findings, so these are the average resilience scores and the percent of households found to be resilient using the three different specifications of the resilience index. And one kind of general finding is that overall households had quite low resilience, unfortunately. Across the different indexes, generally the patterns were the same in terms of, for example, the hanging in group having lower resilience ratings and the stepping up and stepping out having higher resilience scores. But there were instances where the relative resilience was different depending on which specification you use. So for example, if you look at scores for Palombe, you see in the case of the Prosper specification using 12 indicators, Palombe had above average resilience. But if you look at the 8 indicator specification, they had below average resilience. So that suggests that there's a lot of space for these results to depend highly on exactly how the index is constructed and what indicators are included. So just to note that the KPI-4 was not the only approach to looking at resilience under the BRACC and Prosper programs. So there were other performance indicators for the BRACC and Prosper programs that were related to resilience in different ways. And those were used both in reporting by the implementing partners as well as BRACC Hub in
Hi, Liz. I think we've lost. Is it just me who's lost Liz? Catherine, can you hear it?
No, I've lost her as well. Oh dear. Give her a second to see if she's able to reconnect. If not, we'll make another plan.
I think she's logged off, and probably trying to get back on. Hopefully.
Gloria, would you
Hi.
be able to tell me at what point you stopped hearing me?
Can you put up the slideshow again?
Yes.
You were, Liz, you were just talking about you just started talking to the other slide, the one after following the household resilience index.
You had just
Or
started.
results. You just started to discuss that slide.
Okay, give me just a second. Okay, so just after this, okay, got it.
Yeah, on this slide here, you had just put on this slide and started speaking, then you cut off.
All right, thanks very much. I apologize to everyone. So I was noting that the KPI-4 reporting and the resilience index were not the only approaches that BRACC and Prosper took to resilience measurement. There were other performance indicators that were related to resilience in different ways. And those were used both by the implementing partners in their performance reporting, as well as by BRACC Hub in its evaluation of the BRACC and Prosper programs. There are also a number of different approaches and indicators used specifically for learning. So examples of this included a partnership with the MIRA and RFMS programs to collect high frequency data on a monthly basis in Prosper communities. It also included a number of rapid assessment studies used for learning that utilize different flexible indicators. So one example there is Prosper's evaluation of its cash for inputs program, which looked at indicators such as what % of households actually use the cash for inputs on agricultural input spending. Other examples include the Prosper Markets evaluations, which used a variety of different indicators and rigorous approaches to look at market conditions as well as program effectiveness. And so those kind of flexible approaches appear to have been quite useful for learning and mid-course corrections for the program. One other approach that I will note is that the BRACC Hub in its evaluation of BRACC and Prosper drew on a wide range of data sources and mapped results against the simple theory of change for BRACC. And so this was another way to kind of see how kind of evidence around specific outcomes was contributing to an idea that resilience at a higher level could be changing based on the program theory behind BRACC and Prosper. One thing we'll note is that in this theory of change, some of the outcomes are very specifically related to resilience to climate change. So things like reduced vulnerability to climate risks, but then the theory of change also includes some more traditional development outcomes, such as increased income or reduced hunger, improved nutrition. So some of the challenges that BRACC Hub encountered in the course of working on resilience measurement in BRACC. So the first thing was creating a sufficiently detailed and nuanced theory of change for a highly complex program. So this program included a lot of different interventions. It's taking place in the context of very diverse shock risks. There were objectives related both specifically to climate resilience, but also more broad objectives around things like poverty and nutrition. And all of this created a challenge for fully capturing the specific mechanisms linking all of the different program approaches to the different resilience and welfare outcomes that the program was trying to achieve. And this makes it difficult, like looking back onto that mapping of results against the theory of change, to have kind of a clear story of exactly what picture is going on in terms of specific resilience impact and outcomes. The other challenge that we found was that there was a short timeline to both a lot of the program implementation, but more relevantly to the time for the evaluation. And so this had a couple effects. So first of all, it means that you don't have enough time to observe some of the longer term outcomes. So things that we would expect might take several years for those outcomes even to occur. But then the second implication of this is that because shocks may not occur each year, we don't have enough data points or a long enough time series to observe shocks and the results that might occur under those shocks. So one example here is with the RFMS partnership, those data were interesting and useful for providing some contextual information, but because the data were only collected for a year, that limited the ability to really use it to see how resilience might be changing over time as a result of the program interventions as different shocks occurred in communities. Another really big challenge that we faced was thinking about how to interpret our resilience index results. And so there were multiple issues that came up here. So first of all, as I kind of described before around the indicator with receiving assistance, some of the indicators had ambiguous relationships with resilience. And that's a very obvious one, but some of them were less obvious. So for example, we found that using climate information to take risk reducing actions was actually less common among some of the best off households. And so one of the possibilities there is that because those households may be more diversified into livelihoods activities that are not weather dependent, they may have less need to adapt their activities in response to weather information. So there's a lot of potential complexity around even the relationship between an individual indicator and resilience, especially when you're looking at heterogeneous households. Another thing that was challenging was interpreting the meaning of the aggregated index. So, we had a methodology where we just added up the total areas that households were resilient in, but we didn't really have an understanding of which of those areas might actually be most important and which of those areas might contribute new information. So for example, it might be that there's, you're really kind of capturing the same elements of resilience with two indicators. And so having both of those indicators indicators in the index doesn't add new information. And we didn't really have a good sense of the extent to which that might be occurring with our index. And then the last kind of major factor is that there was no clear meaning for the resilience index threshold. So it wasn't clear what it really meant to surpass that threshold. A couple other kind of more minor issues. Some of the indicators were not always sensitive to the impact of interventions, and this related to two things. So in some cases, there might be a bit of a mismatch between the causal mechanisms that we would expect to see as a result of the specific interventions and then the actual data that we were collecting. So for example, some of the general agricultural practices training focused on different seed spacing, and our climate smart agriculture indicators in our quantitative surveys didn't really capture that. Another example are hard to move indicators. So for example, with a lot of our women's empowerment and women's role in decision-making indicators, nearly all households were already achieving this definition of resilience. And so there's not a lot of room to move that, especially within a very short time frame. And then the last thing, which Catherine spoke a bit in the in a program design presentation, there were some cases where our evaluation methodologies were not as agile and adaptive as the program implementation side was. So one example of this is specifically with our randomized control trial. That's a very rigorous method for having a very good counterfactual for estimating impact, but it also takes a lot of time for the results to come back. And it's not necessarily well suited to looking at specific interventions or small tweaks in approaches. So some of those learning needs were not necessarily well met by this large kind of time-lagged RCT approach. All right. So moving from kind of those challenges to some recommendations and lessons learned. So the first thing relates to, again, this idea of building off a really specific theory of change for your policy or program. And so that is to leave space to customize resilience measurement frameworks that specifically relate to program theory of change with respect to resilience of what, to what, and for whom. So again, you're making sure that your particular measurement approach captures the changes that you are likely to see with your implementation approach that you're taking and the specific shocks that you're trying to address, and even potentially the types of households or communities that you're trying to work with. The second recommendation that we have is that there's a need to better define resilience specific measurement versus general poverty and welfare outcomes, and balance focus on the two within programs. So in some cases, your general poverty and welfare outcomes may be highly relevant to the work that you're doing, and they might especially represent short-term objectives for your programs, such as improving food security or improving income. While at the same time, you may also be looking at building long-term resilience to specific types of shocks. And in some cases, your outcomes and your approaches may be complementary, but there may also be tension between those two objectives. So one example here could be, for example, if you are encouraging adoption of irrigation without at the same time taking into account hydrological studies and things like that to ensure that water usage is sustainable, that irrigation uptake in the short run may represent a good way to increase incomes and possibly even short-term resilience of incomes to weather shocks. but it may also be in tension with longer term sustainable incomes that are resilient to larger climate events. A third recommendation that we have is to be judicious in the use of RCTs. So while our team believes that RCTs can be an extremely powerful tool for evaluation, good for looking at understanding the impact of specific interventions or bundles of interventions that are new and innovative, they may not always be a very good fit for a large, complex, and adaptive program. And in that case, it may be worth considering other more flexible approaches to impact evaluation that still enable you to develop a reasonable counterfactual as the basis for your impact measurement. Related to that, for many projects, simple, transparent approaches and focusing on a few high quality, very well understood indicators may be best. So with many indicators, as we saw with our resilience index, there were some indicators where I think we didn't fully understand the nuances of the linkages between that indicator and resilience outcomes, particularly for different types of households. So focusing on a few indicators that are clearly related to your theory of change, that links interventions to specific resilience outcomes, can be perhaps a better and more sensible approach than a highly complex evaluation framework, including a lot of indicators and indicators that are composite, where they're combining different indicators into one high-level indicator that may be hard to interpret. If you do choose to use a resilience index, our recommendations were, number one, to be sure that you have the technical capacity to construct it and interpret it well. And this is something that FCDO's KPI-4 guidance does highlight. However, one of the elements of the KPI-4 guidance with respect to resilience indexes was the specific recommendation of using a threshold. And we felt that, especially in the case that we observed with BRACC and PROSPER, the threshold was not a particularly useful or clear way of thinking about how resilience works for these households and how resilience can improve. And so our recommendation is actually that projects should not use a threshold in the context of as a resilience index unless that threshold has a clear practical meaning for resilience index to specific hazards. And then lastly, more research and data are needed to provide evidence linking systems and capacity indicators to resilience outcomes in the context of Malawi. So in order for projects to have these high quality, well understood indicators, probably more data sources and more research are needed to be able to identify what are those simple indicators that can be used in these capacity or systems evaluation approaches that are validated as being important for resilience to specific shocks in Malawi. And so I think I'll give a shout out to RFMS who's here and initiatives like that that are providing data sources that could potentially be used for some of that work, validating specific indicators linked to resilience outcomes. All right, thanks very much. So that concludes our recommendations, and now I'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you for making what is probably a huge compilation of information into something that we can definitely understand and make sense of and learn from. I won't take much time. I will just immediately go into opening up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and then they can be responded to. But while we wait for those indications, maybe we can go into the chat box where we have quite a number of comments and questions. I see Catherine has been quite busy responding already to some of them. So maybe I'll just start with this question, which came up as you were presenting, Liz. This is from James, who asked, the resilience index approach was calculated per household over what period of time? Maybe you could just quickly answer that, Liz.
Sure. So the resilience index was actually calculated twice over the course of the project based on 2 household surveys. So the first was the Prosper's 2020 annual survey, which covered outcomes over a period of 1 year. It was conducted, I believe, around July and August of 2020. And then it was calculated again in 2021 as part of the BRACC Hub evaluation. And our data were collected in the same time frame of the year, and again, covered data over the previous 1 year. We've only included the results for the 2021 evaluation in this case. There were some small differences in both the survey sample and in the way questions were asked. And so while most of those indicators are comparable across the 2 surveys, there are some questions about some of their comparability over that time. And this is kind of another example, I think, of something that makes the measurement is not quite as agile sometimes as program learning needs, because one of the key things with reporting KPI 4 is being able to look at a comparable measure of resilience over time. And so one of the things I think we saw as a challenge is that we wanted to be comparable, but as we were getting data, we were also learning more about our indicators and learning that some of them perhaps weren't as clear-cut indicators of resilience as we thought that they might be.
Okay, thanks so much. James, I hope that answers your question. I can see you have commented on that. So Lisa and Catherine and Elaine, I've got a few questions here, and I'm thinking you can let me know who's going to take which question. I'm just going to read them out, and if anyone feels that the question is not answered in the previous comments, please just comment, and then you can get a follow-up response to it. So there's one question here from Tom, who was extending on Arnold's question. So Arnold was asking that he was hoping to hear more on government experiences and involvement in the design or implementation of BRACC, not just experiences of IP funders and coordinators. And this stems from the fact that such interventions have to be owned and sustained by the government when the project ends. So what did government learn from BRACC, and can government sustain or take over these activities? And as an extension from Tom, he said that extending this, are there any lessons that could inform coordination, horizontal and vertical, between government actors with different mandates, budgets, projects, and the like, and coordination between government and non-state actors who increasingly hold and control the implementation resources? Shall I let you take that one, or do I bring in another question first?
I can respond to that one briefly, Gloria. On the partnership with government, absolutely, we agree that that is key, and the program was designed to work very closely with government, particularly at the district level. And actually, yesterday we did have a discussion with various district government representatives from the 4 Prosper districts to share some of the findings, and it was great to hear from them that well, they kind of reinforced what a lot of the program beneficiaries had reported to us at the time of the evaluation data collection, which was August, September, October last year. They said that because everything was very much capacity building and knowledge based, they would be able to continue even if their part of the program had come to an early end. And some of the district government staff confirmed that that some of those interventions, livestock pass on, village savings and loans and so on have continued, even though the project has come to an end. And because of the close partnership with them, they are able to support that process. We have mentioned also on Tuesday that the partnership with district government in implementation was stronger than it was with national government. But national government coordination was more kind of around sharing implementation experiences and of course now sharing lessons learned, which has been through the Joint National Technical Committee and through some of the existing UN government fora. And we will also be doing a presentation with DODMA next week, when we will probably focus a lot on this resilience measurement aspect, because of course it's so relevant to NRS implementation. So the government coordination aspect has been there, and we hope that will help ensure that some of the experiences here are built upon in some of the many other related initiatives. Back to you, Gloria.
Okay, thank you so much, Kat. I hope that answers your question, Tom and Arnold. Catherine did promise a heated discussion on a couple of questions that were raised by James, Tom, and Stan. So I'm going to read them out, and then I'll give you, Kat, the first chance to respond, and then Liz can come in, and Elaine, if she's also on the, I don't see Elaine on my line. So the first question from Tom was that, looking at the best practices for resilience, one, context specific, responding to project design, etc. One is inclined to conclude that resilience is not amenable to comparison across space, time, or indeed between projects. Is there scope for a national standard given the heterogeneity of socioeconomic contexts, approaches, funders, implementers, etc.? And then Stern also asked, was the aim to measure resilience in general terms for the household, or consideration was only in relation to BRACC investments, thinking also of the contributions from other players on the ground and other confounding factors? And finally, Stern asked again, also the extent to which this involved qualitative dimensions in terms of understanding the why question for the different results coming out. A bit more detail on how this was being done. Was it done like the CRS, one on a monthly basis, or over time span, or over other time spans? Sorry. So Catherine, you can respond first, and then pass it on to Liz.
Sure, I think we'll probably say some of the same things, and I think all of those are related. So I think we've already answered the question on the timing. For this particular resilience index, it was those snapshots in 2021 and 2020. But obviously, as I said in the presentation, ideally with the high frequency data, that could be assessed on a more regular basis. And specifically in the context of the BRACC program, the focus was really on showing the resilience improvements in terms of was the program effective in doing what it set out to do, which was to improve resilience. So yeah, with that context in mind is obviously important for evaluating the findings. And on given the context specificity and so on, does it mean that it would be difficult to have a national standard for resilience measurement? I would say no. I mean, one of the challenges with, I guess with all indicators actually, but with resilience too, because of the multiple dimensions, the more you want to make something comparable across a number of different contexts, the less specific it can be. And to a certain extent, KPI 4, because it has to be applicable to all of the global contexts in which FCDO is working, couldn't be very specific, because otherwise how would you be able to compare the situation in Malawi with the situation in Brazil or wherever else? So I mean, of course, something that is Malawi appropriate would have to be have a lesser resolution than something that's comparing two neighboring villages, but as long as there's that strong theory underpinning the indicators that you choose, and you have the capacity to collect data to compare them, and you make them appropriate for the scale of comparison, I do think it is possible to to have indicators to use for resilience measurement in a Malawi context. Liz, what do you think? Agree or disagree?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll quickly also just address technically on KPI for the question about, is it specific to the BRACC interventions versus general? And so, yes, so KPI 4 is designed to specifically look at aspects of resilience that the program it's used to evaluate are targeting. So in the case of designing the KPI 4 resilience index, the indicators are specifically selected to reflect elements of resilience or aspects of resilience that the program interventions are targeting. So it's not designed or meant to be a general measure of resilience outside of the context of the BRACC program, which is in contrast to some of the tools like REMA, which I think are more intended to speak to general resilience of specific outcomes like food security. In terms of, is it possible to design or desirable to design a kind of one standardized measure of resilience for Malawi? I'm a little more cautious on this than Catherine, I think. I think in theory, it is possible to design standardized tools measuring resilience. But I think it comes back to, again, being very specific about the resilience of what, to what, and for whom. So, you know, for example, as we saw, the factors that are important to resilience in the context of the hanging in households might not be the same as those for stepping up or stepping out. And I think, you know, the other thing is that there are different pathways to building resilience, which I think is related to those different groups and their potential graduation pathways. So for example, I think one of the things that I kind of observed in some of the outcomes, looking at correlations within the samples that we were looking at, there's resilience around availability of cash, and there's resilience around food security, and the things that feed into the two of those outcomes aren't necessarily the same. So I think in terms of using, kind of defining a unified measure of resilience, I think you do have to be quite careful. You know, coming back to the example of REMA as a tool, REMA I think is a good approach because it's data-based, so it's empirically driven, and it's a good way to incorporate a lot of different indicators and take into account which of those are most important in resilience. But one kind of thing about REMA is that it's specific to a particular welfare outcome, so usually food security. And so I think, you know, it is potentially possible to design very sophisticated tools like that that provide a standardized approach.
Hi, Liz, we've lost you again. Okay, Catherine, can you confirm that it's not just me?
That feed into resilience of food security for a household are different over time and are different in different locations of Malawi. So I think, you know, my opinion is that it could be possible, especially around specific elements of resilience, but very challenging and would have to be done very carefully.
Thank you so much. Elaine, do you have any comments to any of the questions and thoughts that have been shared?
No, I'm good. I think they're being answered. Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Tom also says, condition, define resilience of what to what and for whom. So particularity to specific resilience outcomes makes sense. Thanks, Liz and Catherine. Tom sounds happy. Okay, there's also a comment here from Heather. She says there are efforts under NRS to look at more standard protocols for measuring resilience under EAD or DODMA. Great to share approaches across the board, including BRACC, and define what works across the Malawi pillars. Thank you so much, Heather. Okay, I don't see any other questions and comments. Are there any other questions or maybe just thoughts from our presenters looking at the comments and how the reception of the findings has been?
Gloria, if I could just come in a minute, I think that there was also a question about the role of qualitative data in resilience measurement. I just wanted to also quickly address that.
Sure, go ahead, thanks.
Yes, so the qualitative data were not used explicitly in the resilience index or KPI reporting, but the BRACC Hub did use a lot of qualitative data in our evaluation of BRACC and Prosper. And we did find it to be extremely valuable for understanding some of the mechanisms around resilience. And some of those findings also fed into our thinking about what the resilience index should look like and which indicators it should include. So I think that there's a lot of potential for using rigorous qualitative approaches to help better validate some of the quantitative approaches used to resilience measurement. And recently there have been, I've looked at a few papers that use really interesting approaches that combine qualitative data with machine learning approaches to help identify indicators that match up to the local communities' perspectives on things like resilience or empowerment. So I do think that there's definitely scope for doing a lot more to bring qualitative data to bear to improve resilience measurement.
Gloria, have we lost you? Either that or you're speaking, but you're on mute.
I think Gloria had to step out for a second and sorry about that. Maybe we can just cover.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I'm just scanning the chat box. Were there any questions posed in the chat box that we haven't addressed yet? Please feel free to shout if we've missed them. It's great to have so much feedback and discussion, and yeah, we are really hoping that the work here can feed into the ongoing NRS discussions, because we know that it's very topical at the moment. Or if there are any other questions or comments.
Okay, I think you guys did a great job of responding to all the questions. And we don't seem to have any more comments in the chat box. So unless you guys have any last thoughts that you'd like to share, Catherine or Elaine.
No, all good from my side, thanks.
I'm good as well, thank you.
All right, so it looks like we managed to do this in record time, which is great. So if there are no other questions or comments, I think we'll be bringing the session to a close. I know one comment that came up quite a lot was the question of whether we'd be sharing the reports or the slides and any of the content. And as Catherine has said, there are briefs that are being developed which summarize the bigger reports, but both of these will be shared on the BRACC website, which I also shared the link in the chat box. But for those that had registered, I think you also had the chance to indicate whether you wanted the report shared with you. So for those that indicated yes, you will be able to receive the reports in your email. But if you did not, you can still access them on the website. Yeah, and so Catherine, can we close the session?
Yes, of course. If all questions are covered, which looks like they are, then yeah, of course we can close.
All right, great. Thank you so much to the team, Catherine, Elaine, and Liz, for taking us through what are incredibly large amounts of information in a way that has helped us to really get a good perspective on what has been done in the BRACC program. I think there's been quite a lot of learning, and a lot of learning was generated in a very short time. And I think a lot have also mentioned how it would be really important to make sure that these lessons do reach policymakers, decision makers, so that's government, and we encourage everyone who participated in this session to also share widely once you have access to the briefs and the reports, to also share them widely. We really hope that they can be used in future programming and also inform discussions that are ongoing right now. So once again, thank you to everyone for participating and for such an interesting discussion, your thoughts and your questions. Like we said, the briefs will be finalized and these will be available on the website. I will share it again in the chat box before I close off. And if you have not registered and you want to receive them, you can also just type in your email directly to myself or Catherine, and we'll make sure to add you on the mailing list. But thank you so much for making the time and for your attention. I wish you a good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you and goodbye.